Up until about 2 years ago. I was working as an attorney there for quite a long time and felt the Lord's call in my life to come to seminary. And so we put the family house on the market and we sold the house and we picked up our two kids. They're 14 and 12. And we moved down here to Texas almost 2 years ago now so I could attend seminary full time. And so I've almost learned y'all and things like that. We're getting there. But what's interesting to me is that so many people who live here are from other places. You know, when we first came here, we thought it was going to be cowboy hats and boots, and it was going to be all over the place, and we weren't going to fit in at all. But we have found that so many people are from other places. Just met this young man from Seattle, and I've just been here about as long as we have, and I know lots of you are from other places too. So it's interesting when you come here what you expect. And we found that on our block, we were the newbies just not very long ago, and 4 or 5 families have moved in since we did, and now we feel like old veterans on our block when we've been there even less than 2 years. So that's our story, and that's how we came to DTS and how we came to Dallas. So we're enjoying our time here, and we will see what the Lord has next for us. We don't know yet. So, and that kind of leads into our story. Oftentimes, we don't know what God has planned for us. And so we're going to talk this morning about Ruth chapter 1, and it's a story about God's providence. The entire book of Ruth, God's providence is all over the book. And it's an interesting story about how when we don't know what is going to happen to us next, or we're lamenting in whatever circumstances that we are going through, God always has a plan. And so even now, as we're here in seminary and we feel like this may be a stopover for us, we may be moving on to somewhere else, we may be staying here, and sometimes it's stressful for us because we just don't know what's going to happen to us next. God's providence is the thing that gives us peace, because we know that God is in control even when we don't know what's coming next. So a little bit of background on the book. Of course, in the Bible, the book of Ruth follows the book of Judges, and that's because it fits together chronologically. Ruth took place towards the latter half of the period of Judges. And Judges, of course, recounts Israel's increasing apostasy. We see a pattern all throughout Judges of Israel's apostasy, and then they're being conquered by some empire that came in and took them over and killed all their people, and then the people realized how sinful they were, and they prayed for God to deliver them, and God would send a judge to deliver them. God delivers them from their enemies, and then the apostasy would begin all over again, and the cycle starts again. And we see that all throughout Judges, very many cycles of that. The period of Judges was from about the year 1370 to the year 1041, when Saul became king. And so it's a period of 300 plus years, and the events of Ruth took place towards the latter end of the period of Judges. And what's interesting is that though chronologically the book of Ruth fits at the end of the period of Judges, in Hebrew Bibles, the book of Ruth is usually found right after Proverbs. And that's very interesting, because if you remember how Proverbs ends, you have Proverbs 31, and it talks about a woman of excellence, right? The Proverbs 31 woman is one who just is a blessing to all those around her, to her family, and she gets up early in the morning, and she earns money for her family, and she raises her children, and all these things of excellence that the woman of Proverbs 31 does. And then Ruth follows right on the heels of that. So you have in theory, what an excellent woman should look like. You have her in Proverbs 31. And then you get to see what this woman looks like played out in real life. And that's kind of why they're put together in the book of, in the Hebrew Bible. So it's interesting that that's the way that they decided to do it. We have this apostasy in Judges, But the book of Ruth is a book of hope. And I think that's another thing that's interesting about this, is that Judges can be so depressing when we just read about these people make the same mistakes over and over and over again, and they get conquered, and then they pray, and then they're delivered, and then they apostatize again, and the cycle just continues. And you're reading the book and you're thinking, do you people never learn? What is it going to take for you people to learn? But the book of Ruth is a story about hope. And although there are circumstances in Ruth that are difficult for Naomi and for Ruth, we see God's hand at work throughout the book. So, as I said, the events happened at the end of the period of Judges, so approximately 1100 BC or so. And traditionally, they say the author of the book is Samuel, although there are some problems with that theory, so it's best to say that the author of the book is unknown, and yet we still know that it's God's inspired word. So what we're going to do is, I thought it would be nice to have somebody else read this for us. So if you can turn to Ruth chapter 1, we'll have it read to us, and then we'll go on talking about it.
Judges ruled, there was a famine in the land. So a man from Bethlehem in Judah, together with his wife and 2 sons, went to live for a while in the country of Moab. The man's name was Elimelech. His wife's name was Naomi, and the names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem, Judah, and they went to Moab and lived there. Now Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. They married Moabite women, one named Orpah and the other Ruth. After they had lived there about 10 years, both Mahlon and Chilion also died, and Naomi was left without her 2 sons and her husband. When Naomi heard in Moab that the Lord had come to the aid of his people by providing food for them, she and her daughters-in-law prepared to return home from there. With her 2 daughters-in-law, she left the place where she had been living and set out on the road that would take them back to the land of Judah. Then Naomi said to her 2 daughters-in-law,
"Go back, each of you, to your mother's home. May the Lord show you kindness, as you have shown kindness to your dead and to me. May the Lord grant that each of you will find rest in the home of another husband."
Then she kissed them goodbye, and they wept aloud and said to her,
"We will go back with you to your people."
But Naomi said,
"Return home, my daughters. Why did you come with me? Am I going to have any more sons who can become your husbands? Return home, my daughters. I am too old to have another husband. Even if I thought there was still hope for me, even if I had a husband tonight, and then gave birth to sons, would you wait until they grew up? Would you remain unmarried for them? No, my daughters. It is more bitter for me than for you, because the Lord's hand has turned against me."
At this they wept aloud again. Then Orpah kissed her mother-in-law goodbye, but Ruth clung to her.
"Look,
Said Naomi,
your sister-in-law is going back to her people and her gods. Go back with her."
but Ruth replied,
Don't urge me to leave you or to turn back from you. Where you go, I will go, and where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord deal with me, being ever so severely, if even death separates me.
When Naomi realized that Ruth was determined to go with her, she stopped urging her. So the 2 women went on until they came to Bethlehem. When they arrived in Bethlehem, the whole town was stirred because of them, and the women exclaimed,
"Can this be Naomi?"
"Don't call me Naomi.
she told them,
Call me Mara, because the Almighty has made my life very glitter. I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi? The Lord has afflicted me. The Almighty has brought misfortune upon me.
So Naomi returned from Moab, accompanied by Ruth, the Moabite, her daughter-in-law, arriving in Bethlehem as the barley harvest was beginning.
Okay, so that's Ruth chapter 1. So just to review it a little bit, we start out with the family living in Bethlehem, and we have Elimelech and Naomi. And Elimelech, by the way, in Hebrew means "my God the King." Melech means king, and Eli is God. So, my God the King. Interesting use of the Hebrew. They had 2 children, Mahlon and Chilion, and then there was the famine in the land, and so they went on. They left Bethlehem up here, and then traveled around and down into the land of Moab, somewhere down here. So we know that the story happened in the days when the judges judged. That's from verse 1, and that's the period of 1370 to 1041. And as I said earlier, this is toward the latter end of that period, so we can count back from the genealogy, which we would see in chapter 4, and figure out about 1100 was when the time that these events took place. And the irony in the first verse is that Bethlehem in Hebrew means house of bread. Beth means house, of course, and hem means bread in Hebrew. So what we're talking about is the irony being that there's famine in the house of bread. And so they're forced to move on. Or are they forced to move on? And so I'm interested to see what you folks think about that. Do you think that they showed lack of faith in going on to Moab? Or do you think that that was a reasonable response regarding the circumstances that they had? There's famine in the land. They're Israelites. They're supposed to be in Israel. Do you think they showed a lack of faith, or do you think that they responded reasonably? What do you think about that? Yes?
I think they showed lack of faith. The fact that when they heard that God provided food for Israel, they should have waited for God's provision. To mix with the Moabites, to marry the women, was specifically forbidden. To be in the land where they sacrificed, I believe, their sons in the fire, past me in the fire, I believe that's Moloch. Is that the correct God? Was abominable. They should have stayed in Israel.
Okay. All right. Anyone else?
I think Naomi was more caught up in, like what Ronald said, was caught up in her own provision rather than trusting the Lord. So she took it upon herself probably to leave and go to greener pasture.
Well, I always say probably less Naomi's decision than Bimelech's decision. It would have been the husband who would have made that decision, I would think.
I would think you're probably right. It was a patristic society, of course, and men do make most of the decisions, but I've never heard of many men who didn't have some urging from their women, and even then, I'm sure that she had an effect on the decision-making process. So it's interesting, yes. Maybe they did show a lack of faith, and yet it's amazing what God was able to do through the story. And so the question really is to get us to thinking about maybe it was a lack of faith, maybe it was a reasonable response, but either way, God used what happened and he turned it into something amazing. So they go on to Moab, and here's the family in Moab. You have Elimelech and Naomi, and of course they're still married, and they have their 2 sons, Mahlon and Chilion. From chapter 4, we know that Mahlon married Ruth, although it doesn't say that in chapter 1. We're told that in chapter 4. So Chilion married Orpah. So that's the family as it existed in Moab. But then Elimelech dies, and Mahlon dies, and Chilion dies, and so we're left with Naomi, Ruth, and Orpah. And of course, the thing that ties these people together are the marriage to the sons, right? Without the sons, there's no bond except that there are daughters-in-law, but yet there are no children. So it's really quite a loose connection. As any grandmother would say, you want to be near your grandchildren and you want to be close to them, but there are no grandchildren, and Ruth and Orpah really, now that the husbands are dead, there's not a whole lot of ties that bind. So Naomi urges them both to go back to their homes and go back to their gods. Orpah does go, but Ruth stays. And so Ruth and Naomi end up together and deciding to go back to Bethlehem. And so that's where we pick up the story here. In verses 6 to 22, there's just some things I want to mention. Most English translations say the Lord had visited his people in Bethlehem. And so, of course, that doesn't mean he came down from the clouds and, gave them crops. It means that he caused rain. And the rain obviously turned the soil into something that was fertile, and so now there could be there could be rain, which resulted in crops, and there's food. And of course, Naomi hears this in Moab, and she decides that it's time to go back. I thought it was interesting, the verses 11 through 13, where Naomi is urging the daughters to stay because she's too old to have more children, and so what she's probably referring to here is the custom of Levirate marriage, which is spoken about in Deuteronomy 25. And that custom is that if a widow dies, if the husband of a widow dies without children, the next son in line is supposed to marry that widow and give her offspring so that the name of the first can be carried on. So that may be what is being referred to here. And of course, Naomi is saying, look, I'm old, I'm too old to have children, and even if I had a child today, are you going to wait around until this child is of marrying age? That doesn't make any sense. Go back to your own people, go back to your own mothers, go back to your own gods, and marry there. Return to your gods is interesting. Verse 15. Gods in the Hebrew is plural, and so you get the word Elohim or Elohi depending on the preposition that goes with it, but it's to your gods, and it's a plural. And the interesting part of this is that, of course, Moab is a pagan land, and they believe in multiple gods, many deities, but they also believed in one god that was predominant over all, and his name was Chemosh. So when you see a Hebrew that's plural like that, the word gods, you ask yourself whether this is a plural of majesty or a plural of number. Are we talking about multiple gods, or are we talking about this one particular god? And I think in this case we're talking about Chemosh, but we have to acknowledge that what Naomi is urging them to do is to go back to their pagan land and to go back to their multiple gods. And so you're asking yourself as you hear this, does Naomi acknowledge these gods? Does she believe in these gods? Or is she just urging her people just to go back to their traditions? Is that more what she has in mind? And the story doesn't really tell us, so we're kind of left to wonder about that. And as we get to know Naomi a little bit more through chapter 1,